Hello, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We are presented by Merriweather and Tharp, and we are happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us today. What a show it's going to be for us. What a weekend it's going to be. What a night we had last night at the Marlowe's Tavern in Brookhaven. We just feel so excited about Go for Two in 22 season, and we can't wait to celebrate all with you on Saturday from Atlanta and then everything else that comes up after that. This is going to be an unbelievable time. So we have a show today that reflects that. Obviously, Terrence Edwards comes by as he does on most Thursdays. We'll talk some Georgia LSU and the SEC championship with a player that was lucky enough to win an SEC championship while at Georgia. That's been a theme for us here this week. I don't know if you've noticed that or not, but we've tried to hit that theme here pretty hard a good bit, and Terrence Edwards can talk more about that on today's show. Also, the guy that'll call the game on CBS Sports, Brad Nessler, he will be on before we're all said and done there as well. So we are fully loaded to give you every angle on Georgia and LSU, including an aspect of Georgia that probably still doesn't get enough credit, but we'll show you some evidence of just how successful Georgia has been in one very, very important category. We'll get to that. There's big news about the future of college football. We can't let this show in without discussing that, of course. But off the top, a nice defense for Georgia by Kirk Herbstreit, the leading voice in the sport, and maybe another example of why, as we said yesterday, Georgia fans, Georgia players, the Georgia team itself ought to have maybe just a little bit of a chip on its shoulder right now. I like stirring the pot with this kind of stuff because the edgy version of Georgia part of the Tennessee game really seemed to work. The edgy version of Georgia to begin this season against Oregon, that really seemed to work. What do you say we try to get that edginess back here and show a little teeth going into Go for Two in 22 season, including against LSU on Saturday? We'll begin that way right now. DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I have to begin today with a thank you. We had such a great night last night at the Marlowe's Tavern in Brookhaven for our Go for Two in 22 kickoff event. Marlowe's always so hospitable and take such good care of us. And great food, fun beverages, just a great time. And so many of you came out. It really was a special time for me, and I'm excited about everything that's happening for Georgia over the course of the next few weeks. And I just love this time of year because it's Christmas and everything else. And I just thought last night was a perfect way to get all this started. So if you couldn't be there, we really missed you. We'd love to have you for one of these live events sometime in the future. And for those of you who were there, and boy, there were seemingly hundreds, for those of you who were there, thank you so much for making this such a great time. And I just loved it. So I want to say thank you for that. I also want to tell you we have a great show for you planned today. Brad Nessler from CBS Sports, he'll call the game at 4 p.m. on Saturday. He's going to join us live on the show here coming up in just a few minutes. Terrence Edwards, as always, on a Thursday, we'll talk to a player that won an SEC championship at Georgia about what it means to bring home that trophy, bring home that championship. That's been a little bit of a theme for us this week, if you might have noticed, and we'll keep that going here today. And we're just getting ready for the SEC championship. But as a way of doing that, I also want to kind of keep a little bit of a theme going that we had yesterday there as well. I think the best version of Georgia right now is a little bit of a nasty version, a little bit of a mean version, a little bit of an edgy version. There's no doubt that's the Georgia that existed to begin the season, and I think a lot of that was brought on by the fact, as we said during the offseason, how in the world does everybody sort of unanimously believe that somehow Georgia's inferior to Alabama, a team that had beaten the national championship a year ago, and a team like Ohio State that was nowhere to be found in the college football playoff a year ago back in 2021. Yet to begin this season, Georgia had no shortage of doubters. Some of that even kind of came out of the woodworks for that game against Oregon to begin the year, assuming that Georgia would kind of fall flat on its face and not live up to the promise of winning a national championship that was somehow some sort of fluky one-and-done type thing. And those critics were out there before the season began for Georgia, and Georgia went out there and shut them up in a mighty way by beating Oregon 49-3 and kind of rolling through early part of that schedule, including a dominant win at South Carolina, for instance. And then before the Tennessee game, now Tennessee's the new flavor of the month. And, everybody's so excited about their offense. And, that game at the beginning of November, all of a sudden the same critics and naysayers seem to pop back up again that somehow Georgia had no shot in its own stadium against Tennessee because, as we were told at the time, Georgia had no playmakers on offense. Remember Jordan Rodgers saying that. They had the kind of defense that was exposed. And what was the anonymous coach saying at ESPN.com that week? That Georgia was going to have 50 points hung on them by Tennessee, or maybe it's even more than that. Whatever it was completely ridiculous. And that sort of edginess that all of those naysayers, and listen, around here, we told you, going to that Tennessee game, I admitted flat out, I was trying to troll you. I was trying to get you upset. I was trying to get you mad. I was trying to get you kind of stirred into a frenzy because I felt like that was the best version of Georgia. And who could deny that day in Sanford Stadium, this wasn't a festival. This wasn't a celebration of the pageantry of college football. This was an absolute street fight, and Georgia jumped them coming out of the tunnel. And you were there. You are part of it. You made it happen. We said that the Georgia crowd that day would have a chance to make it happen, and I think that anybody who was there, if you watched it on TV, I think you would attest, they absolutely did that. My ears were ringing for days because of how intense that atmosphere is. And here we are again going into the postseason, and I think the time to find that edginess, the time to find that intensity, on the one hand, yeah, we're grateful for what Georgia's done, but as we said to begin this week, we're greedy for what they can do going forward. And frankly, we're a little bit angry about the number of people who seem to continually line up here and doubt it as a possibility. That's the proper mindset to fuel you as you move towards SEC championship and college football playoff and eventually go for 2 and 22 and bring home that second national championship here in the Kirby Smart era, the second in as many years. I want to set the stage for more of that here today, but let me start, though, with a little bit of a counter to all of this. And it comes from the most prominent voice in the sport, because sometimes when you hear people continually talk about Georgia as somehow if they're 8-4 or somehow just sort of lucky to be a part of this discussion, you're left to wonder, wait, am I crazy? Now, the answer to that for me may be yes for a million reasons, but in this particular instance, at least one prominent voice would lead me to believe that, no, my thoughts that Georgia actually really is a good team, that the 12-0 is not a mirage, and that the ranking of number 1 by the College Football Playoff Selection Committee is not some sort of egregious error, that I'm actually not so crazy for thinking, hey, you know what, maybe Georgia is actually pretty good. Kirk Herbstreit was on TV on Tuesday night when the number 1 ranking came out. We were also live on video, so I missed this at the time, but our friends at Saturday Down South transcribed this quote, and here is what I think is a pretty strong defense by Herbstreit of Georgia maintaining the number 1 ranking. And the mind of Kirk, who's on TV and have every reason, like what's her name, to kind of fan the flames of every kind of possible storyline, Herbstreit just doesn't choose to do that. As far as Herbstreit's concerned, this isn't really a debate at all. This is Kirk Herbstreit when it comes to all of this. He says, I thought Georgia would hold on to that top spot, being the defending champs. He says the way they've played all year, there's really nothing that they've done, regardless if you want to go through every week of their schedule, they deserve to be at the top spot. Can we just pause on this here for a moment? That for all the nitpicking that goes on of Georgia, here is the loudest, most prominent, most famous voice in the sport saying, hey, I've watched these guys every week. I don't really see a reason right now why they're not number 1. And I think that's kind of an important thing to consider here about what's actually going on with Georgia. Sometimes we hyper-focus on little small things because Georgia football is the topic that we all obsess over, either as a vocation or a pastime or whatever else. But Herbstreit says, I am watching these guys. I don't see any argument against them being number 1 right now. He goes on to say, despite Michigan having, as somebody else said, maybe the best win of anybody and what they did against Ohio State, I think both those teams go into the last weekend, championship Saturday, if they lose the game, I still think they're in. So that's Herbstreit there saying, from my perspective, I think that Georgia is still number 1. And yeah, Michigan may have the best overall win in the country. And frankly, on this show, we have no problem disputing that. The best win in the country this year belongs to Michigan. But life existed prior to last Saturday, and the things that happened prior to last weekend also matter in this too. I think Herbstreit correctly points out that, yeah, congratulations, Michigan, you won a game. You beat Pillow-Soft Ohio State again. And yet, that's not the only thing that has happened of note here this season, that we're actually counting all of this, dating back to the beginning of September. And on the totality of the year, Georgia, who has won comfortably and convincingly against 4 ranked opponents right now, that is enough to keep Georgia at number 1. And it's kind of nice, I have to say, to hear the most prominent voice in the sport, Kirk Herbstreit, expressing that. And I'm also going to say this really quickly. This is kind of an aside, then we'll get back to the topic. Y'all, some of y'all, every time Kirk Herbstreit says something you don't like, you kind of jump on him as an obvious Georgia hater. You can't call Herbstreit a Georgia hater, because this is not the first time that Herbstreit has come aggressively to the defense of UGA on some sort of topic. Now, I don't love everything that Herbstreit does all the time, but over the years, Kirk Herbstreit's actually been a pretty forceful advocate for UGA. Remember 2018? He even kind of talked him up after the 2020 season. And here he is again. When you think he might have some motivation to support the Big Ten on all of this, He's actually kind of stepping up to sort of support UGA. You probably ought to give Herbstreit a little bit of credit for that and maybe give him a pass. The next time he says something that we might perceive as dumb, give him a little bit of a pass for that, because in this particular case, once again, he's sort of come to the aid of UGA. However, Herbstreit, the big prominent voice here, stands in sharp contrast to some of the other things we have heard recently. We played some of this for you on the show yesterday of no matter how much Georgia is number one, no matter how much guys like Herbstreit may say that status is unquestioned, that does not stop people from questioning it. And we gave you some examples of that yesterday. I'm going to give you another example here right now. That somehow, even in Georgia's position of towering over the sport, somehow they're still cowering under the bed, afraid of a team that, as it stands right now, won't even be in the college football playoff. Y'all, this is the kind of stuff that I think should make you mad. And part of me does this just to kind of push your buttons. I mean, I'm trying to create the right vibe going into the postseason here. But in a roundabout way, a show like this sort of exists to rebuke some of the things that just don't make any sense. And this, to me, is one of those things that just doesn't make any sense. Let me go to Andy Staples is a guy from The Athletic, longtime college football writer, and he does a podcast. We're going to get into the podcast part of this in a moment. But he was on Twitter kind of talking about what he and one of his colleagues, a guy called Ari Wasserman, were saying about Georgia and kind of the scenario here for them. And I want to show you the tweet here because the phrasing here, I think, is really pretty interesting. What Andy Staples says is his colleague, Ari Wasserman, is calling Georgia a quote-unquote loser right now. So here's what Staples says. That Wasserman says that Georgia also lost the Michigan-Ohio State game because now the Bulldogs are just a USC loss away from having to play the next most talented team in the semifinals. He means Ohio State. So what Andy Staples is saying here is the guy that he works with, the guy named Ari Wasserman, that Georgia somehow was a loser from the Michigan-Ohio State result because all of a sudden now Georgia's going to be cowering in fear of playing an Ohio State team that wasn't good enough to make the playoff last year. As it stands right now, won't be good enough to make the playoff this year unless they get some help. And somehow Georgia, who Kirk Herbstreit, I believe, correctly touted as the obvious number one team in the country, is now afraid of Ohio State. This is nonsensical talk here, but let me give you a little bit more on this. Staples and Wasserman from their podcast kind of going into more detail about the behemoth that is Ohio State. And apparently the big story here right now is not the teams in the playoff or the teams standing at the top of college football, but somehow, some way, the big story in college football is the teams as of right now who are nothing more than spectators for the playoff, including Ohio State. Here is some of Staples and Wasserman from The Athletic debating the merits of just how great this Ohio State team is that just got skull-dragged in its own stadium, just how great apparently this team is. Here's more from Staples and Wasserman on that.
If you kidnap Kirby Smart, would you rather play a 12-1 Pac-12 champ USC or an 11-1 Ohio State that lost to Michigan and Columbus? He's going to say, give me the Trojans. And I'm going to say,
is there any part
Buckeyes.
of you that could talk yourself into thinking that with Caleb Williams and this Heisman push that he's on, Jordan Addison and all those weapons offensively, that there is a
Kirby Smart would be dreaming of scoring 80 on that team?
So, first of all, I think he's all right about that. I think that Georgia salivates over the chance to beat USC. So as much as we might kind of beat up on the national media from time to time, they're not wrong about everything. Even a broken clock's right twice a day. They're not wrong about that part. Georgia would love the chance to play USC. There's very little doubt in my mind. You can give Caleb Williams 19 Heisman trophies. That doesn't change the fact this USC defense is by far and away the worst of any team that's competing right now for the college football playoff. So Staples is at least right on that part of this. I do believe that Georgia would salivate over the chance to potentially play USC. But the flip side of that, the idea that somehow Georgia is afraid of playing Ohio State and somehow the Michigan result against Ohio State is now a net negative for UGA because they might have to play Ohio State. Here's what I can tell you. What's the old line about lions don't, worry themselves with the opinions of sheep? Kirk Herbstreit told you a moment ago. Georgia is unquestionably the number one team in the country. They ain't worried about number 5. They're not. Georgia's not sitting around thinking of, Kirby told you this week they're not even worried about where they play, which may or may not be true when they get a chance to play in Atlanta. But if they're not worried about where they play, I would argue they're not worried about who they play either, because the appropriate conversation here is not who does Georgia not want to play. I would say the more appropriate conversation here is what other teams need to do to avoid Georgia as long as they possibly can, because based on the season-long totality of results, ask Oregon, what it felt like to play Georgia. Ask Tennessee what it felt like to play Georgia. Ask number 19 South Carolina what it felt like to play Georgia in its own stadium. Ask ranked Mississippi State right now what it felt like to play Georgia in its own stadium. And this whole idea that somehow Georgia's trying to avoid Ohio State, they don't have to worry about Ohio State. Because as it stands right now, Ohio State's not in the playoff. And have you ever considered this as a possibility? Like, what has Ryan Day done for the Buckeyes? I mean, literally, what has he done? Have you ever considered that maybe the best possible solution for the Buckeyes this year is actually missing the playoff and getting a chance to say the woulda, coulda, shouldas of what they would do if they were in there? Have you ever thought that maybe that Ryan Day doesn't want to play Georgia because I think it further illuminates what Jim Harbaugh's shown you 2 years in a row, that he is the biggest paper tiger in the entire sport, that there is nobody more universally touted without actually ever backing up one iota of it than Ryan Day. He looks the part. He's got the same stubble beard that all these, supposed smart guy NFL coaches do, but his teams are not doing anything. I don't care how many Wassermans and Staples and everybody else rank this team in the top 2 in every year in the preseason. They're not backing it up on the field. But that doesn't stop guys like this, and frankly, I don't care about either one of these guys all that much, but it's just representative of the overall national media. That doesn't stop them from blowing the Ohio State horn more and more and more. Here they are again from the same podcast.
Of the teams that could be in the top 4, who has the better chance of actually beating Georgia?
Ohio State.
It's the only way it happens.
And is there a way that you can say that without saying that Ohio State's a better football team than Michigan? Can both of those be true at the same time?
No. Michigan is a better football team. Ohio State is a better collection of athletes. And if the better collection of athletes puts together the perfect day, it can beat anybody.
Yeah, that's right. Like the peak performance of the team with those players is higher than Michigan. So it's like a boom or bust scenario.
Yeah, Michigan is the better team and offers the more consistent, excellent performance.
So color me shocked that someone that speaks with that dialect thinks Ohio State is the best team in the country no matter how many times they lose. Color me shocked that that guy who sounds like that thinks that. But nonetheless, that's probably a different topic for a different day. Here is the overall bottom line for me on this. Like, that statement right there perfectly encapsulates everything that's gone on now for 2 years, is that the preseason opinions can't be wrong. And therefore, if the result, Michigan slamming Ohio State into the turf once again, if the result doesn't match the preseason opinion, then it's not that the preseason opinion was wrong, the overrating of Ohio State that took place during the summer. It's that the result on the field doesn't mean as much because it doesn't match what my preseason opinion was. And yeah, I get it. Listen, I follow gambling. I totally understand that if Ohio State and Michigan played again on a neutral field, Ohio State would be a point spread favorite. I'm not an idiot. I totally understand that. And if you want to start measuring things like recruiting rankings and things like that, something that we do a lot here on this show, I totally get that measurably Ohio State is still among the most talented teams in the country and one of the few teams that actually rivals the overall talent level that Georgia has. We're not fools around here. We totally understand that. But here's the thing that the national media also needs to understand there as well. There is something to be said for doing something with that talent. There is something to be said for matching your preseason expectations and meeting the expectations set by the gambling public and all the Excel spreadsheets that lead to those point spreads. There's something to be said for pulling this stuff off a calculator and actually putting it on green grass or field turf and actually going out there and doing something with it. And year after year after year, Ohio State ain't doing it. And the Alabama team that we were told, oh my gosh, this is the greatest team of all time, because not only do they have Will Anderson and Bryce Young, they've got 8,000 transfers who are going to change the way in which Alabama approaches the transfer portal. That was false too. And guess who's still standing right now the same it was a year ago? It is the Georgia Bulldogs. And just because you didn't think it was going to happen doesn't mean it isn't actually happening. And just because you were wrong before doesn't mean that you don't have a chance to now get it right and acknowledge what's actually taking place here. Now, listen, all this is to say the best version of Georgia is an edgy Georgia. Georgia was edgy before the start of the season, and they went out there and vanquished critics. They were edgy before the Tennessee game. They went out there and vanquished critics. I think it's about time to get edgy again. Georgia could be on a march to go for 2 in 22. There are a lot of people who are a little bit skeptical about UGA's ability to do that. I think showing them how wrong they are, that seems like a pretty good mission for the next few weeks. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Merriweather and Tharp, and we are glad to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, on the radio at noon, on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. So happy to have you with us as we go for 2 in 22 here this year, and it's going to be a fun one. And listen, all this great stuff we get a chance to do, we would not be able to do it without great sponsors for our program, including our friends at Merriweather and Tharp. They are your source for Georgia Divorce. And listen, I get this, is that as we move towards this holiday time of year, getting ready for Christmas and getting ready for everything that comes up after that, as we do that, that does not bring happiness and joy for everybody in every situation, because sometimes the holidays can be a reminder of relationships that are on the verge of being severed, or maybe kind of past the point where you can even pretend that it's not on its way to a conclusion. I get that this time of year is not great for everybody, and I wish I could do something to take that away from you. Obviously, I can't, but I can, I think, do the next best thing, which is talk to you about how to set yourself up for a more enjoyable, happier next season of your life. And that's what our friends at Merriweather and Tharp can do for you. Because if divorce is inevitable, if divorce is a thing that you know you're either about to go through or in the midst of, or whatever your specific story is on that, having a strong advocate on your side to explain the law, to talk about how the law can be leveraged for your benefit, that is what our friends at Merriweather and Tharp are all about. So I want you to find them online, theatlantadivorceteam.com, theatlantadivorceteam.com. And here's what I can tell you. I saw Bob and Ashley Tharp at the Georgia game on Saturday. These are good, friendly people. They are not going to force you into doing something that you don't want to do, nor are they going to force you into doing something, push you into doing something that's not the right outcome for you. In fact, the relationship you might have with Merriweather and Tharp begins before you even have a conversation with them. You can look at the blog post, the podcast. You can educate yourself with free resources and choose to do with that whatever you want to. But then you might have one of those free initial consultations with one of their attorneys. But once again, it's not a pressure conversation. It's simply a kind of a fact-finding mission. They want to listen to you. They're going to give you some information, and from then you'll be armed to make a decision. Hiring Merriweather and Tharp to take care of your divorce situation, to protect your finances and your relationship with your children, all those things that matter on that, and put you in place for a much more enjoyable, much more successful next season of your life. And that's what they can do for you. So find them online, theatlantadivorceteam.com. That is theatlantadivorceteam.com. So we have a very busy show for you. It's Terrence Edwards coming up in a moment. Before we're done, it's Brad Nessler who's going to call the game for CBS Sports. We are going to get into a lot as it relates to Georgia and LSU. Before we do that, though, I want to go around the doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at ServPro. Now, along the lines of, what people say about Georgia and sometimes what people omit about Georgia, here's one of the things I think is kind of interesting right now, that it seems like a lot of the time, and we had some of this yesterday, right? And listen, as I said before, and I think it's important to kind of keep saying this, there is no belief here that there's some sort of natural, obvious bias against Georgia. There's not this natural, mission to hold Georgia down. We're not conspiratorial in that vein. We just think sometimes it's good business to try to bring the number one team down a peg, because if the number one team comes down a peg, then the entire sport becomes a little bit more interesting in the process. This is simply a financially motivated debate that seems to go on around Georgia. This is not necessarily some sort of we hate Georgia because it is Georgia, or we hate Georgia because we don't like Georgians or anything like that. We don't think that's the case. But we do believe that in the mission of trying to make the sport more interesting, trying to make the sport seem like it has a little bit more parity than it might actually do, that some things about Georgia get overemphasized. Maybe some things about Georgia don't get emphasized enough. And like one of the things you commonly hear is, well, what is going to happen if Georgia finds itself in one of these shootout type games? That's what I think our buddy Cole Kubelik brought up yesterday. What's going to happen if Georgia's in a shootout? Can Georgia match the offensive firepower of whatever? And it just seems really weird to me that no matter how many times that conversation gets had, and you can all point out it has happened a lot, that no matter how many times that conversation gets had, do you ever notice that we don't really do this opposite part of that very much of, hey, can one of these high-powered offenses actually move the football against Georgia's defense? Because we're actually starting to have more and more evidence of that not really being the case. And yet, somehow we're always putting the Georgia offense on trial of, hey, can you guys match the offensive firepower of the team you're playing? But we don't seem to put the opposing offenses on trial of, are you sure you can actually move the football against this Georgia defense? And the simplest reason why that doesn't happen is because we've been led to believe over the last couple of years that, well, BA, you got to understand, the sport's changed. Nick Saban told you don't win anything running the football and playing defense anymore. You got to have great quarterback. You got to have 50-point per game offense. The sport has changed. And LSU, a historic team in 2019, or Alabama playing against pandemic defenses in 2020, it sort of looked like that was the case. But have you sort of noticed that hasn't quite been the case quite as much lately in games involving Georgia against stiff competition? It's not quite so true really at all, and kind of flying below the radar of what seemed to be obviously known. And that seems to be the case here. Let me show you this from my buddy Chris Felica, a good statistically minded, gambling-focused guy that's a part of ESPN's College Game Day and a bunch of stuff around ESPN. He does this thing every week where he kind of rolls through a bunch of data for the big games. I like Felica. I think he does a really good job. And here's a couple of things on Georgia. I think this is really interesting. Let me start with this. He tweeted this yesterday. In the last 2 years, Georgia has faced 6 top 15 teams, not named Alabama. The Bulldogs have allowed 13-3, 11, 13-0, and 3 points in those games. And they've won each of them by an average of 24 points per game. He says all went under the total, and Georgia covered the spread in 5 of them. Now, you can also say, okay, well, Georgia had the bad SEC championship game against Bama a year ago. That is certainly true, but they also held Bama to, 18 in the national championship there as well. But against the non-Bama top 15 teams that Georgia's played, that's what LSU is coming into Saturday, 13-3, 11, 13-0, and 3. So, to me, if I were to take that information from Chris Felica there, I would say that the real, question to be answered for a big game that involves Georgia is, hey, not what does Georgia do offensively to keep up with its opponent, but does the opponent have any chance of scoring against UGA? The data would suggest there that's the most important question. Yet, for some reason, we don't often hear that question asked. We certainly didn't hear that going into the Tennessee game. Did you hear anybody prior to the Tennessee game asking, hey, can Tennessee score against this Georgia defense? Did you hear anybody asking that? You heard plenty of questions of, hey, can Georgia score enough to keep up with the Tennessee offense? You heard that plenty. But did anybody say, can Tennessee score against the Georgia defense? If anything, we heard that the Georgia defense was going to get exposed that day. It didn't happen. Nor, as Chris Felica is saying, has it happened very much when Georgia has played against its best overall competition. And if you're a gambling-minded person, I'll give this to you just for free. Felica, once again, here on what those really stout defensive performances for Georgia have meant for the overall total. Let me show you this to you here. Felica is saying since 2018, Georgia has faced 16 top 15 teams, not named Alabama, and the game has gone under in 14 of them. So if you're a gambling-minded person, our friends at MyBookie will give you a point total there on that. Georgia's been a pretty easy under to cash in games like this in the past, so I guess do with that what you will. But the bottom line here for me is that the most important unit going into this postseason, including, by the way, this USC offense that's going to have the Heisman quarterback in Caleb Williams, the most important unit is the Georgia defense. Now, admittedly, this group is constructed a little bit different than last year's group was, and on a per-game basis, I don't mind telling you, they haven't been rushing the passer as well as I'd like for them to. But they are still a team that is getting it done against the best teams that has played over the course of the last 2 years, this year included. And if Georgia is truly going to go for 2 in 22, they're going to have to show up and do it in a big way again, and I wouldn't put it past them to do just that. That is Around the Doghouse here today, and it's presented by our friends at Serve Pro. And, of course, this Georgia defense looking to do damage to some of the teams that it's playing here coming up. However, when you've had damage done to you or the home that you live in or the business that your livelihood depends on, you want to play defense against that, and that's where our friends at Serve Pro can step up and help you because their restoration specialists are able to clean up your mess commonly caused by fire or water intrusion or something like that. They're able to clean all that up and get it put back together like it never even happened. That is what Serve Pro is all about. They've been doing this for a long time. They have honestly, genuinely done this for us here at DawgNation. We had our big, you may remember, a big water leak in our studio a couple of months ago, right there on a game day, worst possible time for this to happen. We had Serve Pro over here. They were cleaning it up, getting it done, and put all back together, and things have been great ever since then. That is what Serve Pro is all about, fixing all this stuff up and making it like it never even happened. So you can trust them on all of that. You can find them online, servepro.com. That's SERV, servepro.com. If you're dealing with fire damage, water intrusion, anything like that, our friends at Serve Pro can clean it up for you and leave it like it never even happened. So trust all of them today. All right, so before we're done on the show today, Brad Nessler's calling the game for CBS Sports. We will talk to him about what he expects from Georgia and LSU. And we'll also get into the meaning of the SEC championship from a guy who knows the SEC landscape as well as anybody does. But for now, to keep a theme going we've had going all week long, as a Georgia player, what does it mean to bring that trophy home? Well, let's talk to a player that did that back in 2002, 20th anniversary of the 2002 SEC championship. Great time to talk to Terrence Edwards here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather & Tharp.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Terrence Edwards here. Always love having him as part of the program. He's got a big weekend here, too. Big showdown in the state semifinals. We may squeeze a question or two about that in before we're all said and done. But before that, Terrence, every former player we've had on the show here this week, we have asked the same question to because they've all won SEC championships before. What it meant for them to do that. You were a part of a Georgia team that won an SEC title for the first time in 20 years. It was a long drought that came to an end, and you were a huge part of that team, an all-SEC performer on that team that year, and obviously a record setter when it comes to your receiving yards. What does it mean to you, though? You guys beat up on Arkansas big time that day. You were a big favorite, almost like Georgia kind of is here in this spot there as well. But you brought home a trophy that Georgia had been chasing for quite a long time. What did it mean for you personally to be a part of an SEC championship?
It's one of the best times in my football career, being able to help, our prestige university bring a trophy that was not in our possession for 20 years. But it also goes back to once you able to do a lot of those things or achieve some goals that a lot of former players who put the hard work in just as you did, you that goes to all of them. It's just not – we didn't feel like it was just for us. We did this for my brother, Johnson Sconfeld. He did it for Matt, so on the boss. Boss did it for his brothers and all the other former players that came before you who, put in the hard work and just didn't happen for them. This was for them as well. So I feel like a lot of, the current players, especially with the national championship last year, that trophy there was for everybody. The fans especially, but the players that put in the hard work and didn't get the opportunity to play, that was for them. So, bringing an SEC championship means a lot, and I just thought about it. The last time we won one in 2016, I think it was, so we haven't won an SEC championship in a while. So, been 20 years since we won our first one, so this would mean, this would be special as well.
Well, it's one of those things where you want to believe that you played the very best program. We've seen some of that in the NFL this week. You had the stuff that Najee Harris said about kind of taking a jab at Georgia. You had Mike McDonald, the Dolphins coach, kind of poking at Tua, calling Georgia the best SEC program. That this stuff carries on into the professional ranks, and you, I'm sure, experienced that during your career as well, that you want to believe you played at the best program. And for a long time prior to your time at UGA, that's the level that Georgia was trying to aspire to. And then after that, it was trying to aspire to that national championship level. And now that has happened, and there is a certain pride that comes along with, even if you're Brother Robert and you played in the 90s, you still take pride when you see the program that you helped build, the program that you helped usher into this era, go on to have, greater success after you left. There is a level of pride that comes through that. So I think you're 100% right that, Georgia wouldn't be where it is right now if not for the contributions made by players prior to that, even guys who didn't taste the same level of success this current Georgia team is tasting. And so when that trophy is brought home the same way it was for you in 2002, in a roundabout way, I do think a little tiny piece of that kind of belongs to everybody, doesn't it?
Oh, most definitely. I think we all take even though we didn't play, I think all former players, and I'm just speaking from the former player perspective and not a fan, just from a former player, that piece of trophy, I took a little bit from that trophy, even though I had nothing to do with it as a player or as a contributor on that team. But I just think the foundation that I was able to lie as a receiver and the team that I was on to build that foundation kind of helped win this championship, even though it was 20 years ago. And that's the way I felt about our SEC championship team, that the players before us kind of built the foundation, and even though they didn't achieve the level of success that we did, they're still a big part of that. And I almost tweeted at Najee that Tyler Simmons was on side. So he want to call our national championship week. What about Tyler Simmons being clearly on side? That would have changed the landscape of that game, but your championship now. We almost tweeted him that, but you know what? In history, it's not going to say week. It's going to say 2021 national champs.
No, I like that, Terrence. I do. Let's talk about this game on Saturday for a moment. I want to do something with you on both sides here. Here would be my concern about Georgia. And while I do genuinely believe that Georgia's going to win the national championship, that doesn't mean that I don't have some concerns, or that doesn't mean that I don't think there are a couple of areas in which Georgia has to raise its level of play. And for me, one of those is on the offensive side of here. And I actually don't care that much about style points. This is not one of those things of, hey, Georgia didn't make it look pretty enough against Kentucky or Tech or somebody like that. I truly don't really care all that much about that. But I do think there's something to be said. I know, Terrence, you like basketball. In fact, that's, I guess, probably your first love. that in the NBA, you have this thing where you have like load management and like down the stretch, long regular season. A couple of teams kind of turn it off near the end of the regular season in the hope they can kind of turn it back on for the postseason. And it sort of seems like in a roundabout way, that's kind of what Georgia's going to try to do right now, because they've openly admitted they took the ball away from the offense against Tennessee because they didn't feel like they needed to score anymore. And they didn't take any risks against Kentucky because of the wind. And frankly, Tech wasn't good enough to do against anything against them, so they didn't show you much last Saturday. Well, all of a sudden now you're in the postseason where a switch that you flipped off, and I think admittedly Georgia did, they're going to try now to flip it back on again. And there's a part of me, not being a former player, not being a former coach, that maybe doesn't quite know how that works. There's a part of me that wonders, okay, Georgia has intentionally throttled back its offense seemingly. Can they now intentionally throttle it back up and go back out there to laying waste to people like they were earlier this season? South Carolina, Oregon probably most prominently there on that. You understand the offensive game as much as anybody. What would you say about the notion now that Georgia's about to start trying to do something again that it may not have been trying to do all that much the last few weeks?
It goes with the level of maturity of your offense and your team. If that's the case, that we flip the switch off and just kind of grind it out, I could take a silver lining to that, because we did see the running game come about. We were complaining, or not say complaining, we was asking questions about, are we the same Georgia team? We're throwing the football more. What's happened to the O-line in the running game? Well, we kind of shut it down a little bit and showed people that we can, and we are able to run the ball with Kenny McIntosh and that group, and the offensive line and Coach Thursday have done a good job of running the football, opening holes. Now, your quarterback is very mature. He's a very mature young man, and I think the coaches trust him now. Okay, it's the playoffs now. And that's been the whole sentiment of me this year, that Georgia coaches trust him. If you just look at the pass attempts from last year, I think it was 14 to 15 per game. Now it's almost up to 30 per game. You don't throw the football that much if you don't trust the quarterback to make good decisions. And yes, Stetson's going to make a decision in every game that's going to leave all of us to scratch our head. But as long as he's making more of those better decisions than the ones that's not, then you can live with those, as long as it's just not in a crucial point of the game. So can they turn the switch on passing-wise? I think they can, because they trust their quarterback to put his team in position to make the right plays.
On the LSU side of this could be just as simple as, hey, Jaden Daniels not healthy, therefore LSU doesn't have a chance. I mean, sometimes we overanalyze these games, and maybe on the LSU side it's that simple. We're going to hear more from Brian Kelly here on this Thursday. Maybe he'll be sandbagging and gamesmanship and not tell the truth, but it could be that he reveals that Daniels is still a little bit banged up, and if that's accurate information, then LSU's chances of even being competitive in this game have gone down. But let's say for a second that he is healthy enough to be something close to his top-end performance. Like the other shot I sort of give LSU here, Terrence, as a way of kind of keeping this game a little closer, giving themselves a chance in the fourth quarter, I do have great respect for their wide receivers. For all you want to say about what Harold Perkins has done defensively, and that's obviously a huge part of this game, one of the parts we haven't probably talked about is this still sort of feels like a little bit of a typical LSU wide receiver room, and a chance to maybe get the big play that gives them a chance to narrow this gap against Georgia. I kind of have some respect for them on that.
I think so. And overall, this might be the best wide receiver room that we have played all year. Butte is very good. He was touted to be a top 10, top 15 draft pick coming into this season, so he has talent. LSU is always going to have talented wide receivers. And I'm going to switch to the defensive side, where you have two guys that can rush the passes. When you have a guy that can rush the pass and get out the quarterback with B.J. Ojulari and the Jenkins kid, they can disrupt the game without even having to bring pressure. So, yes, they do have very talented wide receivers, but they have two guys that can rush the pass, and that's always scary. So, we do have two legitimate tackles, so that's going to be the game where I'm going to be watching. Can our tackles eliminate the two pass rushers that they have?
I want to ask you about this because you brought this up on social media this week. There were a lot of people who were obviously hoping that the Eric Gilbert story would have this happy ending of getting a chance to come back and play against his former team and, do that in this SEC championship. And yet we know, based on the stuff that Kirby Smart said this week, that, hey, that's a journey that Gilbert's still on right now. And every indication that I've gotten, Terrence, is that Georgia's fighting for him, fighting with him, working hard, along his side to give him everything that he needs, and yet it's not quite done and completed yet. Obviously did not dress last week at home against Georgia Tech and did not travel with this team to Kentucky in the game prior to that after having been a part of the 70-man roster the 2 weeks before that. You're an important mentor to Gilbert, and you said on social media this week that you absolutely support what Georgia's doing here. This is one of those things that never stops being a topic of conversation for Georgia fans. So would you mind just kind of addressing, obviously to the extent that you want to talk publicly about this, about why it was that you wanted to step up and speak publicly about this week? Gilbert not quite ready yet, Georgia working hard on his behalf, and you, as someone who knows this family very closely, seemingly in support of all of this.
Yeah, I just, people have asked the question in the media to Kirby the last few weeks about Eric. And I just think that, we see his talent. And, one thing that I told you that the All-American season for him is just to be the best person he can be. That has nothing to do with football, that he can just get back to being a young adult. So I think everybody just thought it was just going to magically appear that he comes in. The young man is dealing with a lot of stuff that it's just not overnight. It's just not going to be, healthy for him. And, he's just trying to, and Georgia's done a good job of just bringing him on slowly, not putting a lot of pressure on him to be this athlete that we think he could be. It may take a year. I mean, it's just like an ACL surgery. You're not going to be your best version the first year. So, I think everyone just wants to rush this young man back into the spotlight. And I kept saying, we're going to just take it slow. And I just knew, what the process was going to be in. And I just think everyone else didn't realize or didn't really understand, what was going on. And of course, because they didn't tell anyone that, and I understand that, that's why I tweeted like I 100% agree with how Coach Smart and Georgia Bulldogs handling him, because as I put it, a lot of things is bigger than football. This young man, even if football stopped today, he has the rest of his life to live. So I believe they're doing it the right way. They're doing it slowly and not just forcing him into any kind of situation that he's not ready to be in. So kudos to them, and that's why I tweeted that the other day.
Terrence, your team on Friday night, 5 p.m. against Mill Creek. Very good team. Obviously, Caleb Downs is a load to deal with, but you guys had a great season there as well. First-year coaching staff back in the state semifinals. That's quite a story there on the Milton side as well. We wish you best of luck there in that game, and we'll look forward to seeing you Saturday as a part of our DawgNation post-game show, reacting to what we hope is a Georgia win against LSU here in this SEC championship.
Thank you. I can't wait, and go Dogs.
Yes, sir.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Unfortunately, this is becoming a little bit of a theme for us, or a little bit of a trend, I guess the word I'm looking for here. We're getting pretty heavy on the show content. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to give you a quick shout-out here for our SEC Through, and then we're going to get ready in a couple of minutes to bring on Brad Nessler here from CBS Sports. We're going to roll from one guest to the other. So I'll give you a couple of SEC topics. Literally, I'm not kidding you, I've had stuff on my SEC Through topic list now for 3 consecutive days that we still haven't gotten to yet. So I guess it's that kind of week here around DawgNation. But I do want to give a quick shout out to our friends at Royal Caribbean, because Robin Wash from Royal Caribbean was with us last night at the Marlowe's in Brookhaven. Our good friend Jessica Slater stopped by to see us there as well. Terrific travel agent that we kind of got to know through Royal Caribbean. And we had a great time. And they were obviously, they're hanging out. They love what we do here at DawgNation, which is always kind of a fun thing to hang out with them. And we were also talking a little bit. I'm really happy to tell you this, that next week I have been invited to be a part of a special kind of a promotional cruise on part of Royal Caribbean. You've heard me talk before about Wonder of the Seas. Wonder of the Seas is the largest cruise ship in the world, and it's repositioning to Port Canaveral, which is kind of my home port in a lot of ways. And so next week I'm going to have a chance to be on a special short sailing for Wonder of the Seas, come back and tell you all about it, and talk to you about how you can take a great cruise vacation there on board Wonder of the Seas. So I'm really, really excited about that. I'm going to give you more details about what that means for the show next week. We're going to still have shows. We're still going to have them. It's too important of a time of year not to have good, fun content. But I will be away some next week working on my Christmas winter tan. They're on board Wonder of the Seas, getting a stopover at Perfect Day Coco Cay. So I'm really excited about that. And speaking of Perfect Day Coco Cay, you can also be a part of that with us on the DawgNation Cruise. Jessica Slater helps you out with that. 770-718-9147. That's her number, 770-718-9147, the number to get in touch with her. You can also check her out online, royaldogs.com. That is royaldogs.com. That's the website she's put together. that gives you all the information you need on that. So check that out with her. She's getting you ready for the Royal Caribbean DawgNation cruise coming up in April. And I have to admit, I am very excited myself about being on board Wonder of the Seas for a short cruise coming up next week there as well. So we're looking forward to all of that. That is going to be a great time. And we're going to get ready to bring the music down here and bring on Brad Nessler from CBS Sports. And obviously we're going to talk to Brad about a couple of things. He clearly understands the nature of this SEC championship game, and I think that's an important thing to kind of keep reinforcing here a little bit about what it would mean for Georgia to bring this trophy home, something it has not done since 2017. So with that, we'll move on now and get ready to talk to, from CBS Sports, the guy that'll call the game here this upcoming Saturday afternoon, right there from Mercedes-Benz Stadium. It's Brad Nessler. And Brad, we certainly appreciate your time. We thank you for being with us as always. And obviously, you know this SEC landscape. You know the city of Atlanta, too, the place that's host to the SEC championship game for a long time. For a Georgia team that won the national championship last year and has kind of national championship aspirations of its own again this year, how much would this SEC championship trophy mean to this team on Saturday in your mind?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, Brandon, think that once you've won the national title, the SEC title doesn't mean anything, but it does to these guys. You know, it's another ring, it's another feather in your helmet. It's something that the team last year couldn't do, and I think this year's team, and there's nothing wrong with this. I think they're out to prove that they're as good, if not better, than last year's squad, and to do that would mean running the table, and I think that's what's on their mind right now. That very few people have done the 15-0 Clemson and LSU, and I think they're bound and determined, not only to win this weekend, but to carry it right on through the playoffs. So I think it means a lot to them. There's a handful of guys, Chris Smith and some of those guys that played, or at least were on that team back in 19 when LSU pretty much dismantled them. And so there's a little bit of that factor going on, too. I think there's only 2 LSU players that are still on the team from that game. But, guys have a lot of pride in this kind of thing, and to say you're SEC champions means a lot.
And what I'm about to say is easy for me to say because of what I do for a living, and it'll be easy for you to agree with because of what you do for a living, yet nonetheless I'm going to say it anyway. I also think there's something special about this game, and I've been to a bunch of them. You've called all of them. I'm talking about, in every aspect of college sports for a long time. I just think the atmosphere in the building for an SEC championship just feels different than most games feel. And maybe this year a little bit different because LSU's only 9-3, but I get big game vibes from the SEC championship that really have not been lessened in this college football playoff era. And I think something like that still sort of matters in a roundabout way.
Yeah, no doubt. I think Georgia fans are a little bit jaded. When you've been there 5 of the last 6 years, it's like, 4 years, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I had people bothering me for tickets all the time. And, this year there hasn't been as big a rush. Let's put it that way. They're all gone, by the way, so don't call me now. But, there's such a push. And when the game is Alabama and Georgia, I think it's a bigger thing. LSU obviously took some glamour away from it by losing to Texas A&M. But still, it'll probably be a 75-25 crowd, though. I think it's going to be a Georgia home game without a doubt. But it does have a great feel, and I agree with you. Once you get in the building and everybody starts filing in, there's a special feeling about it. So regardless of who's playing and what the records are, I still get a pretty big buzz out of it like you do.
When we have tried to talk about this game on the field here this week, it seems like every topic ends up going back to Jaden Daniels and his health. And not to say that that's the only chance LSU has to win this game. But, boy, it's a very different LSU team if he's either hurt or trying to play and not 100%. As you're doing your own preparation for this, and that includes talking to some of these coaches and things like that too, in your own mind, can you get past that part of this, that if Daniels is healthy, then maybe they have a chance to do some of what they did against Alabama, and if he's not healthy, then maybe you understand all of a sudden why Georgia's 17-plus point favorite here in this spot?
Yeah, the 2 games that I've done of his games, he was sensational. And, the way he played against Florida, Alabama, the other games they won in that 5-game stretch, maybe not so much the last of the games, and then not Texas A&M. Man, when he's on, he's really fun to watch. And he's their hope. I mean, they don't really have a ground game if you take him out of the equation. Josh Williams has missed the last 2 games with a knee injury, and he should be ready to go, but he's not that dynamic a player. John Emery is a guy that's been around a long time, is just kind of a guy. He's their legs and he's their hope. And when he's playing well and when he's healthy, there's not many cats that are as dangerous as he is. So I hope he's ready to go, because I think that they keep it close at least for a half if he's in the lineup and at full strength. Otherwise, I just don't see that they've got a lot of hope, but LSU fans would disagree.
I want to talk about the Georgia side of this too, because when you guys had them for the Georgia-Tennessee game, and maybe we're sensitive about this and we noticed more than was actually there, but it seemed like there was a lot of doubt about Georgia going into that. There had been an ESPN story about, hey, Georgia defense. You had some, prominent analysts and things like that talking about, Georgia's maybe inability to keep pace with the Tennessee offense. And that day, as you know, turned out to be a very good day for UGA. And it sort of seems like some of that kind of stuff still exists right now, not for the game against LSU, but beyond that of, is this really the kind of number one team, Georgia currently ranked that, but the kind of team that can actually make good on that and march through and win a national championship again? When you look at Georgia, for the good, for the bad, everything else in between, how well positioned do you think they are for what comes next after LSU?
I think they can be as good as they want to be. I think they've played a little bit down to the competition recently, and I don't know if it's just fatigue from the season. If they were, I've heard people say that they think they've been holding things back and saving it for, the playoffs, and I suppose that's possible. I don't think that's really the way Kirby looks at things, but, their points per game has dropped down just a little bit in recent weeks. Stetson's numbers last week against Georgia Tech were pedestrian, but he still threw 2 touchdown passes. I think they're as good as they want to be, and I think when they get geared up for like an SEC title game or the playoffs that follow, whether they win or lose this, they're going to be in, and I think you'll see them at the level that they were, when they were really rolling in the middle of the season. So I don't think it's complacency. I think it's just, you get kind of tired at the end of the season. I talked to Archie Manning the other day, and he said, I'm going to see you this weekend at the SEC Legends thing, because Peyton and Eli are both going in the SEC Legends thing. And I basically said, I have to wait and see, Arch, because this is the time of year where my butt starts dragging a little bit. So I think, everybody sort of feels that way, and nobody's 100%, right now. So I think when you get geared up for a big game, all that goes away, and I think you'll see Georgia at their best from here on out.
Hey, Brad, it's great to have you on the show. We certainly love your call. Looking forward at 4 p.m. on CBS on Saturday. The entire team there at CBS Sports, we think, do a great job with the SEC. So enjoy this one. We're always grateful for your time here on our show, and hope you have a great holiday season coming up here as well.
You too, Brandon. Let's have a good championship weekend. Talk to you soon.
Sounds great. Brad Nessler there from CBS Sports. You love that. And I think his phrasing there on Georgia is really interesting. He says, hey, I think this team can be as good as it wants to be. And there's a lot of weight packed into that. And, we can totally be honest about this, that if there are people out there who've kind of grown with some doubt about UGA, or if there are people even willing to express some skepticism about Georgia, it's not like Georgia hasn't fueled that discussion at times this year. I mean, obviously, we don't have to pretend anything other than that is true, that Georgia had lackluster performances, against Missouri. That's not the kind of team you'd expect it to be the case for. And in some of these moments late in the season for portions of games, right? And that's really what it kind of comes down to. It's a portion of the game here and a portion of the game there and a portion of the game there. But over the course of, time, that kind of adds up to being something. And Brad also kind of points out something that we ourselves have noticed. That the tangible outcome of some of what Georgia's been doing in recent weeks, the place that shows up the most is the fact that Georgia is dropping down in terms of its points scored per game. At one point in time, Georgia was I think they got as high as 8th, and they were in excess of 40-plus points, which would put them, a couple of points per game more than they averaged last year, and, right there with really anybody in college football. And as of late, they're still pretty close to where they were last year. They were 38 point something. They're not 38 point a little less. I mean, they're within a couple of tenths of a point of being offensively what they were doing a year ago, but they're now outside the top 10 there in that category, and that was kind of one of those things that last year, Georgia really made the hallmark of what it was doing. Top 10 in both offensive and defensive categories, the advanced stat stuff, the more simple kind of old school metric stuff. They were just kind of a sure thing top 10 kind of in both sides, and offensively they've kind of dropped down from that a little bit the last couple of weeks. But you're also kind of left to wonder, as we talked about with Terrence Edwards, okay, well now it matters again. Now you're playing, a team that you have maybe more respect for, or maybe you have circumstance where you feel like you need to do a little bit more. Are you going to be ready on the heels of all of that to sort of jump back in here and just start being yourself again? Are you ready to do all of that again? I think that's a pretty good question to ask. Pretty interesting thing to sort of look like as it relates to all that. So we'll talk about that. I also want to give a couple of shout outs here before we get ready to sign things off. Here's what we're going to do. Let me do a couple of shout outs. I am then going to talk about one of the topics I want to do for the SEC through, because this is important news that we need to get to. And we'll get ready to wrap up things after that. First of all, our friends at the Durham Law Group, they bring the UGA injury report to us each and every Saturday as a part of our DawgNation pregame show, which we call our Kroger Kickoff. And when you yourself are dealing with an injury, when you're hurt on the job or you're injured in an automobile accident or anything like that, our friends at the Durham Law Group want to step up and do great work for you, because they don't just practice personal injury law. They really define personal injury law. And to me, that starts with this. When you are in a situation where you need to be made whole, you need to be made right, when you're looking to win in some sort of legal proceeding, you want a lawyer that's willing to make the commitment to you of, hey, no fees, no expenses unless you win. They don't benefit unless you benefit. And that's one of the promises that our friends at the Durham Law Group want to make to you. So you can give them a call, 844-4GA-HURT. That number, once again, 844-4GA-HURT. You can also visit them online at georgiahurt.com. That's georgiahurt.com for a lot more on that. All right, so big news yesterday in college football. It came out yesterday evening. There had been a little bit of back and forth fighting between the College Football Playoff Committee, the organization that makes up the College Football Playoff, and the Rose Bowl about the future of the 12-team playoff. And when college football originally created the playoff, it's very important to understand that there were a lot of people in the world of college football that would have been fine had there been no playoff whatsoever. For a lot of us, especially folks my age and younger, we were, I think, really obsessed with, hey, you got to have a new era of college football, a new time to actually decide this championship on the field. For many of us, it sort of seemed like a no-brainer that college football would eventually move to some sort of playoff structure. That it was weird the sport didn't have that, and this would be a better version of this, and eventually you had to do it. And yet, so many other people who were maybe a little bit older and kind of connected more to the college football past, in which the bowl, even like pre-BCS, when the bowl structure completely defined the sport, it's amazing how many people would have been okay had that just kept right on going forever, because a lot of the people in the kind of corridors of power of college sports at the institutional level, at the conference level, they were making a lot of money off these bowls. The bowls were paying them very well. And it took a lot of convincing to get enough of the right people to agree to do the college football playoff in the first place. And obviously the biggest entity to convince was the Rose Bowl, which had been a huge, huge part of the college football story for everything kind of west of the Mississippi River. Big Ten, Pac-12, they were greatly influenced by the Rose Bowl on this. And the Rose Bowl really would not cooperate to be a part of the playoff unless it got that signature TV window kind of late afternoon on New Year's Day. That's kind of the most prestigious thing. That parade, that Tournament of Roses parade, it's a very big deal to them in the early morning on New Year's Day. They wanted to roll from that into the game itself. And literally, they were fine with not participating in the playoff unless they got their wishes on that. And they did at the time. That was the agreement that had to be put in place to kind of get the playoff moving forward. They did that. But in the 12-team playoff world, in the future, there just isn't any room for that kind of concession when you are now competing more regularly with the NFL, who's moving its playoff windows around. They're kind of encroaching on some of your space, and they're doing more and more of that. And that college football, from a playoff standpoint, just has to be a little bit more nimble going forward. So they were not going to give the same kind of TV concessions to the Rose Bowl. And the Rose Bowl was kind of fighting back against that, and they were kind of trying to hem and haw if they were even going to be a part of it. And so the playoff committee kind of gave them a deadline of, hey, you're either in or you're out on so-and-so day. Well, the Rose Bowl said yesterday, we're in. They're a part of this. They've been willing to drop their demands. And so the end result, and the only thing that probably matters to you, the fan, is that now cements it in its final that next year, 2023, will be the final year of a 4-team playoff. After that, we're moving to a 12-team playoff model where the top 4 seeds are getting those neutral site opportunities. They're skipping past the initial round, and then you're going to have the next 4 seeds hosting teams in their own stadium, leading to a national championship with a more expanded playoff than we've had in the past. Not everybody thinks this is a good thing. I, for the most part, I guess think this is going to be a better era, although it will be admittedly different, and maybe there'll be, like everything else in college sports, some unintended consequences that go with this. But this was the big news yesterday, is that officially it is now done. The playoff is expanding in 2024. Now, the odds are the SEC will have not expanded by then, because the SEC's expansion is based more on the TV contract stuff and the fact that the new contract with ESPN and ABC doesn't kick into the following year, I don't think. And there's just not a lot of financial motivation for Texas and Oklahoma to come into the league earlier than that. It would actually cost them more money than they would make from it. And the other SEC teams wouldn't make more money in the early stages for Texas and Oklahoma being in the SEC yet either. So while we have two big expansions on the horizon here, the one we know that is now happening for sure is the playoff in 2024. But we're still up in the air about when the SEC is expanding. But it could still not be until 2025 on that. So that's the story in college football. The playoff is officially expanding. So this year and next year, those final years when it comes to the 4-team playoff that obviously Georgia won a year ago and that Georgia has a chance to do pretty well in as you kind of wrap up that era of college football. And by the way, speaking of the University of Georgia and the excitement that exists around these dogs right now, obviously a lot of us here in the Atlanta area love the idea of Georgia being right here in our own backyard. And many of you have enjoyed traveling to those games in Athens all year long. But if you're a Georgia graduate or just someone who loves the University of Georgia stretched out across the country, across the world, your chance to connect with that and enjoy everything that is going on with the dogs this time of year through our friends at the UGA Alumni Association, a great website to make you aware of. It's alumni.uga.edu. That's alumni.uga.edu. This is a wonderful season for the Dogs. Back-to-back undefeated regular seasons again, going back to the SEC championship for the fifth time in the last 6 years, and obviously has a chance to go for 2 in 22 and win that back-to-back national championship. This is a special next few weeks, next couple of months here for these Dogs. And so if you're stretched out across the country, if you're somewhere around the world, we hear from people all the time who are connecting from afar. If that's your story, then go to the website, alumni.uga.edu, and you can find out where there's like game watching parties near you, because believe it or not, there are increasingly growing numbers of these game watching parties all over. Or if you want to connect digitally with dog fans, you have the exclusive video content, you have some really cool digital downloads, you have a way to use this website to really get more connected about not just what's going on with Georgia football, but what's also going on with the University of Georgia there as well. So if you want to feel a part of that community, if you want to be reminded of the fact that dogs never have to bark alone, our friends at the UGA Alumni Association can help you out with that. It's alumni.uga.edu. That's alumni.uga.edu. You can find more about that today. And we're going to do a shout out for our friends at MyBookie, but let's just save that for tomorrow and get ready to wrap up today's show. All right, so Golden Shoes here. Told you we had a great night last night at the Marlowe's Tavern in Brookhaven, and a couple of the folks that were with us are also busy on Twitter, reminding you about that important hashtag right now, Go for 2 in 22. So let's give you a couple of shouts out right now on that. Bubby Dean weighs in to say, it better be hella loud in the bins on Saturday when the dogs are on defense. You know it will be, Bubby. Hashtag Go Dogs, hashtag Double Up. You love the idea of that. And then hashtag Go for 2 in 22. Bubby, I love that for sure. Thanks for using that hashtag. Great to see you last night, by the way. And how about our buddy Mad Dog, who was also there with us, and this one of his best, the LSU seal right there on the shore, helplessly looking at that huge, big dog whale come rolling in, and Mad Dog says they can run, but they cannot hide. Beat LSU, Go for 2 in 22. Mad Dog, I love it. It is great, and Go for 2 in 22 indeed. By the way, lousy, stinking Gators. Still got time to hate on them. 331 days from right now, back in Jacksonville, beaten up on Florida again. That is our Gator Hater Countdown. We will see all of you. Special show tomorrow, live from downtown Atlanta. DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. We will look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. So much going on, as I said before. We're going to do something special from the stadium tomorrow, kind of a SEC championship preview, sort of a mega show. A bit. We're looking forward to that. We got huge stuff coming up this weekend, some special video stuff that's going to be rolling out for all of that. So it's that time of year. We are in it up to our eyeballs here right now, and we are glad to have you with us on it there too. So we're looking forward to all of that. We'll figure that out. Yeah, we'll figure all that out. There's all kinds of logistical concerns as it relates to this. So Randy Hall says baseball pitcher Gaylord Perry has passed away, the Hall of Famer. Sad to know that. Perry, I believe, is the only person in the Baseball Hall of Fame, of the players obviously, that does not have a logo on his hat. Is that right? Perry was famous for playing for a couple of different teams, and so therefore he is the only one that's not represented by a logo on his Baseball Hall of Fame plaque. Am I right about that? Some of y'all that maybe know the history better than me may know that better. Matt Rukavina says, don't let all this talk change the fact that Stetson Bennett finished with more passing yards than Bryce Young. Isn't the quarterback from the number one team going to be invited to New York City? Yeah, we're still waiting to see on that. And obviously, I guess with the big game on Saturday, Bennett could still be in this. I'm not quite so sure how real that possibility is. Because here's the one thing I can't quite get the read on. And there's a part of me that I guess I could probably just look this up and research it more, but I don't know that I necessarily care enough to do it. How many of these voters, because you got to understand something, like the number of people who select the college football playoff, that's a small number of people sitting in one room. The AP poll voters, what is that, like 50 or so AP poll voters, maybe more than that, but it's less than 100, I believe. There's like 8 million people who vote for the Heisman Trophy. Like, this is not a distinguished body sometimes. And, some of these folks are turning in their Heisman vote like 6 years ago. And so, obviously, you'd like the thought of Championship Saturday being a chance for somebody to work their way in on this. But you almost wonder, well, how many people are really even still holding on to their vote? So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Who are the finalists right now? Obviously, Williams is like a huge, huge favorite to win it. You almost wonder, what if they were to lose on Saturday or Friday night? Would that open the door up for somebody else? At this point, I don't know. He is such a large favorite. I'm talking about Caleb Williams, that you're left to wonder. You talk about C.J. Stroud, and you have talked about him all year long. But if y'all noticed that Stroud didn't have that great of a year, I'm like, it's just such a typical Ohio State thing. And the fact that all anybody's talked about is C.J. Stroud, but honestly, like, Stroud was not that great. I mean, he was pedestrian. Not pedestrian. That's overstating things. He was not pedestrian. He was very, very good, but he was not great. He was not great. But he's probably still a finalist. I'm assuming that Hendon Hooker will probably still be a finalist, even though he got hurt. I mean, it ain't his fault they gave up 63 points to South Carolina. I mean, I like beating up on the Vols, but Hooker had a great year, so I got no grief with that. No problem with that whatsoever. So we will see. And to Michael, yes, that's right. We're not doing that. But Michael our producer did do us a favor. We had talked about earlier, hey, since we have a little bit of room at the top of the page at DawgNation.com, some of y'all had asked for this. Can we put the link back up for those T-shirts, the Go for 2 and 22 T-shirt, which I have now worn 4 days in a row, I think. So it's right there at the top of the page. So you can go to the top of the page at DawgNation.com and you can get that. The QR code is also right there on the screen if you want to use that. So if you want to be ready to go for this postseason run, you're certainly getting that right there. So there you go. It's right there at the top of the page for you, DawgNation.com now. And the QR code is also on your screen for that Go for 2 and 22 T-shirt. Michael, I certainly appreciate that. To go back to the Heisman Trophy thing for a moment. So you got Williams, you got Hooker, you probably still have Stroud, and I'm guessing you probably have Max Duggan, and now there's only 4 finalists. Last year they started doing this thing where from here until eternity, they're going to have the same number of finalists every year, something they had not previously done. That's your 4 finalists, right? Williams, Hooker, Stroud, Duggan as it stands right now. So it could, and if I'm wrong about that, y'all jump in here and tell me, because there's a very good chance I just am. I have not followed that closely. So could Bennett still work his way in over one of those as the finalist? Maybe so. Josh says, what do you think of Max Duggan? I think he's pretty good. I really do. I have definitely given him my respect. And I respect TCU now as a team more than I probably did earlier this year, because at one point in time, it seemed like every TCU game was kind of the same story of, hey, late in the game, they kind of have to score 100 points to try to win, and so you turn Duggan loose, and he goes out there and does something big for you. He typically did. So I've got no argument about him being a very good player, but also part of the reason why I've kind of grown to respect TCU a little bit more is they've started to play much better defense. They had a good defensive game against Texas, for instance, the other day. This is becoming a little bit more of a complete team here late in the season. Michael Arrington says there's going to be a tailgate that we're a part of. Yeah, we have our Dog Nation Go for 2 and 22 tailgate on Saturday. I have been told that not to even mention it anymore because, unfortunately, the tickets for this always go really fast. And we actually are able to offer the ticket at a price that's much less than our own cost for this just because we have great sponsors. We have, 9 terrific Go for 2 and 22 sponsors that have really stepped up to help make this a great time of year for us. And so because of that, we're able to offer the ticket at what below our actual cost is. And so that's a really cool thing. And then when they go fast, we'll usually do a little bit of a wait list. And if it was up to me, we'd just have everybody, right? But the problem is you've got limitations on how much food and how much beverage and how much, everybody gets a T-shirt, or at least the first 200 people get a T-shirt. and you're just kind of limited on all that. So we'll do a ticket sale, we'll do a wait list, and eventually they'll even kind of cut that off too. And I was told this morning not to even mention it, so here I am talking about it. But the point is like, unfortunately, it was sold out. Kavasi Smoke in the transfer portal, Brian Whitehead points out. Y'all, it's gonna be crazy, and I'm gonna go ahead and just be completely honest with you, is that we're gonna have great shows next week. They will be pre-recorded. We're gonna pre-record them all on Sunday after the playoff announcement come out and the bowl announcements come out, and the Hayes in the barn, hopefully with Samuel Mpemba committing to Georgia. We're going to pre-record some shows, and there's going to be a bunch of news next week. Now, some of it's going to be more like rumor than actual news, but this transfer portal stuff is going to be insane. And I don't step away from the live show lightly. I'll just tell you that we really try not to take too much time off. And when we do take time off, we try not to leave you without a show. And next week's going to be one of those days in which, there may be something big that I wish I was here talking about live. But this is a good chance. Our friends at Royal Caribbean have been so nice to us to invite us to be a part of this. And, this is, a lot of times my wife and I, we don't get a chance to spend a lot of time together, just the two of us during the football season, because obviously I do what I do and we have kids, and you know how that goes. Many of you are parents kind of understand that. So this is a little bit of a chance for us to sneak away next week. And so we are going to take that kind of pre-college football playoff, post-SEC championship. But it's going to be a crazy week. I'm not going to lie to you. It's going to be a crazy week. So we won't be here to cover it for you live. We are going to have great shows, though. These are going to be – one of the things that's really, really important to me is we really try not to mail in the vacation shows. We really try to come in here and do good work. So we're going to try to do that again, but it just won't be live the day of in terms of reacting to this. But y'all better buckle your seatbelt, because the transfer portal stuff, and hopefully a lot of this doesn't involve Georgia, but some of it will. It's going to be just as insane as things have ever been. Stafford Square Dog got his tickets purchased, got a parking pass, and he's driving to Atlanta tomorrow. Can't wait. Stafford Square, I'm glad you're getting a chance to come. That is a really fun thing. And this is one of those deals, and I've told people that this week, is like, hey, I'm not quite sure what you paid, but I told people this week, it's like, if you're on the fence about coming, tickets are coming down a little bit. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I can't believe how expensive tickets are now these days anyway. And I'm saying that as somebody who still purchases my share of tickets, because when my wife and kids go, it's not like Kirby Smart's just giving me some, or as Brad Nessler said, it's not like he's just giving me tickets. I mean, we're buying our tickets. I'm sitting in the press box, but the family's always buying their tickets. So we're still buying a good number of tickets a lot of times. And, I mean, like the days of tickets being double digits in price seems to be just kind of gone. That every ticket now starts with at least a 1, and it seems like more and more the ticket number kind of starts with a 2. Like, that's insane to me. But based on what is kind of just a runaway train of expensive ticket stuff the last couple of years, the SEC championship prices are coming down a little bit. So if you're on the fence about going, it may be an opportunity for you to do that. Okay, so yeah, $250 a ticket for Section 227. That sounds pretty good, Stafford. It really does. That sounds really good, for sure. Let's see what else is going on. All right, over here on the YouTube page. Let's see what else. A little bit of Heisman talk over here. Foster Moss says I should have told Brad Nessler to tell Gary Daniels. Yeah, it's kind of funny. A lot of people don't always love Gary. He says, try not to put together scenarios for Bama to make the playoffs all game. So I did hear that I guess Danielson was doing that some. Was it last week in the Iron Bowl? I really do think this. And I know that sometimes it kind of comes across as a character that I'm playing, but I really do genuinely believe this. I think the media has gotten it so wrong. Now, of course, I'm in a roundabout way a part of the media. I'm not really a reporter, but I am definitely in the media. I think the media at large has gotten it so wrong the last couple of weeks. There is this obsession over, will Alabama get in the playoff? There's this obsession over, will Ohio State get in the playoff? Like, the obsession over what's happening at 5 and 6 is insane. This is like that version of, for those of you that are NBA fans, you ever watch ESPN's NBA coverage, and it's like every other segment is, will the Lakers get the 8th seed? It's like, y'all, at a certain point in time, who cares, right? At a certain point in time, can we absolutely talk about somebody who's actually in a better position than 2-loss Bama or just got embarrassed Ohio State? But the degree to which that people don't seem to move past the, what does it take for Alabama to get in the playoffs? Well, first of all, you got to have the tooth fairy, wave a magic wand and then blah, blah, blah. It's like, honestly, it's just not that relevant of a topic. And some people had said that Gary had done that, which is sort of in keeping with a lot of the other stuff in the media right now of sort of bending over backwards. Is Ohio State laying the weeds? Are they dangerous? Well, based on what I saw against Michigan, no, they're actually not that dangerous. And I know what the spreadsheets say, and I know what the recruiting matrix says. I get all of that. We follow that stuff pretty closely around here too. But we also watch the games on TV, and somehow, some way, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect. The wires don't seem to be properly connected between what the spreadsheets say, what the performance is for the Ohio State Buckeyes. And I would say for the Alabama Crimson Tide, it's kind of the same thing there too. So maybe this is not one of those situations of, Georgia's lucky because it's avoiding Alabama and Ohio State. No, actually, maybe those teams are maybe a little bit lucky they don't get further embarrassment added to them, because what were Bama fans going to say if they lose to Kirby again? Alabama fans are already beside themselves because it's a 2-loss season. Have you ever thought for a moment that maybe the preservation of the Bama program and the prestige of that program is maybe better protected if they don't lose for a third time? Have you ever thought about that? That maybe, just maybe quietly, Nick Saban's kind of fine with not making the playoff, because a third loss for Bama would all of a sudden get people asking even more questions coming into the upcoming season. Or maybe for Ohio State, that has once again proven itself not to be, I would say national championship worthy, that maybe they don't want a second loss. And I'm sure that's not what they're saying or maybe what they're thinking, but let them lose again and see what that offseason kind of turns into over there. So there you go. Let's see what else. Darius Jackson checking in from Columbia, South Carolina. Darius, good to see you. Let's see what else. There's an argument going on. I can't quite tell what patient zero in this argument really is. DMart42 says, this season really proved to me how hard it is to go 12-0, and that doesn't just have to the same value with expansion. I'm all for the games, but I don't expect it to be a good ball. There's a lot to get to there. So let me just say this. As I do think, as we've said before, that the challenge for Georgia is winning all of its games. There isn't one obvious challenge for UGA. You could say last year that Alabama represented that, because Alabama was a team that Georgia had not beaten. They had several chances to, and maybe a couple times it seemed like they were going to, and yet they didn't. And then after the SEC championship, that probably only accentuated that point, that last year's playoff chase for Georgia was about a team. Can you get past Alabama? But once you got past Alabama, there's just nothing like that left. I mean, it's like, can you beat Alabama again? I'm sorry, that does not pack the same punch as can you beat them for the first time. So if Georgia played Alabama, they'd be about a 3 or 4 or 5 point favorite. They'd be less than a touchdown favorite against Alabama. It would be expected to be a close game. But it's not like that's some sort of insurmountable foe in which, oh my gosh, how does Georgia get past Alabama? It's the same thing for Ohio State. Like, as much as I, rag on them, of course they go Ohio State's a good team. And I am also, I follow this stuff. We're not idiots. If Georgia faced Ohio State, they'd be less than a touchdown favorite. They'd be 3, 4, 5, 6 point favorite, something against Ohio State. They're not going to be, double-digit favorite against Ohio State. They're probably not even a touchdown favorite against Ohio State. They would be favored, but not by, some large margin. So, therefore, that's the kind of game that you would expect to be close. And on a very good day, Ohio State could beat Georgia. And on a bad day for Georgia, Ohio State could beat them as well. That, of course, Ohio State's the kind of team that's capable of beating Georgia. I'm not trying to, over-exaggerate my point of view. But the issue for Georgia is not any one team that could be beat, that could beat them, but the challenge of having to beat them all. It's the weight of the journey. 12-0 in a regular season, 3 more postseason games. That's really the challenge for Georgia. And so, as I've said now in as many different ways as I can, as someone who is a Georgia fan who desperately wants to see Georgia win this championship, every game makes me a little nervous, but no game makes me especially nervous. And I just think that's the appropriate mindset here. Georgia could lose to Ohio State, but then things go wrong, they could lose to TCU. If, things go wrong, they could lose to USC. I mean, there is no game in which Georgia is completely incapable of losing. And by the way, I'd put this game against LSU in that category too. But no matter what, national media guy says, there is no opponent that, oh my gosh, Georgia's a loser now because the circumstances have conspired against them. All of a sudden now they've got to play big bad Ohio State. look, if it takes the Red Sea being parted for you to make the playoff, then maybe you're not as good as you think you are. So, yeah, that's my, I guess, thing on that. JJ says the issue is they're making clickbait stories because the current top four are boring to them. I believe you're 100% right. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. Is that the actual narrative of the season is that it's really a referendum on, is Georgia taking the next step towards total unquestioned supremacy? Like that's the real narrative of the season. But if you don't live in Georgia, that's boring. I mean, it really is. I mean, if you live in Kansas City, like that's not moving the needle for you, because the idea that college football is about to get even less competitive than it's been before, that's not exciting. And in light of the Alabama dynasty at least starting to erode, if not completely topple, the hope is, now that opens the door for other people. And you had Cincinnati make the playoff a year ago. Now you got TCU making the playoff this year, and you may have the Pac-12 back involved for the first time since the dawning of the new age. It seems like the possibility exists for parity in a way that didn't before. But if all the Alabama erosion has brought forth is a brand new kind of team like Georgia, if that's all that this is kind of brought forth, well, then that's all obviously not all that exciting for people. So you're right that this is a search for a new narrative. Is like when Tiger Woods was dominating golf, there was this obsession with finding a rival for Tiger. You never quite found it. When Jordan was kind of in his twilight years, it's this obsession with who's the next Jordan, who's the new Jordan, who's the whatever. Then you want more than just like the one big, big boss over the entire sport. That's all this really is. And listen, maybe Georgia's not quite ready to take that step next. I mean, maybe that's the case. I said before, it's a referendum on Georgia. Maybe Georgia doesn't pass the referendum. Maybe they fall short of what exists for them. But that is the narrative of the sport right now. It's not who does Georgia fear. It's how much does the rest of the sport fear Georgia, and how much more will they fear Georgia if Georgia does this year what it seems fully capable of doing. So I believe you're right about that. All right, more comments. Ahmed says, I was hoping that Georgia did play Ohio State, but I really could care less. Honestly, USC would be my pick because I can't stand Lincoln Riley, but TCU would be nice simply because it's a different team. Yeah, I guess rematch of the 2016 Liberty Bowl there on that with TCU. But to me, there's two lines of thought here, Ahmed, and I wrote about this the other day. They don't let me write very much, but every now and then I'll kind of scribble something down. And I think if you're a Georgia fan, on the one hand, you'd be fully within your rights to say, hey, I am simply interested in the easiest possible games for Georgia. And that list of teams might be one thing, and who knows, you maybe end up being wrong about that. Georgia loses one of those games. But if you're making a list of who are the teams that would be the easiest for Georgia to play, you might think one thing. But there's also a line of thought out there of, hey, I really like prestigious games. Who are the biggest teams that Georgia could play? And I don't mind telling you this. One of the most fun things for me, as someone who genuinely enjoys college football, one of the most fun things for me the last few years, it's not just the fact that Georgia's winning a bunch of games, but look who Georgia is playing. When I was a kid, I didn't just dream of seeing Georgia eventually win a championship. I dreamed of seeing Georgia play the kind of teams that kind of only existed in like a magazine or, on some, television network somewhere that seemed well far removed from Georgia. But in just these last few years, I've seen Georgia play Oklahoma in the Rose Bowl. Oklahoma's a huge brand. Georgia-Oklahoma side by side, that was amazing. I've seen Georgia play Notre Dame twice. That's really cool. I mean, I don't mind telling you, that's really, really cool. Georgia didn't beat Texas, but they played them in the Sugar Bowl. So you went from Oklahoma in the Rose Bowl, Texas in the Sugar Bowl, a couple of games against Notre Dame. Georgia played Michigan last year for the first time in half a century down in the Orange Bowl. Like, that's really kind of amazing. And while I don't think this is going to happen, nor do I want this to happen, like, what if Georgia played USC in the Fiesta Bowl? That means in like the last few years, it'd be Oklahoma Rose, Texas Sugar, Michigan Orange, USC Fiesta. Now, I don't want that to happen this year for the obvious reasons, but those were the four big bowl games for my entire lifetime, and those are four of the biggest teams you could play in all four of those, and that happened like the last 5-6 years. Like, that's incredible. It's incredible. And if you're measuring just how much fun this era has been for Georgia football, You don't just measure it in the number of wins that Georgia's collecting during this time, but I think you also kind of measure some of this against the kinds of teams that Georgia's getting to play. That's really, really cool. So to go back to Ahmed's point here, if you did play Ohio State, in addition to just the opportunity to kind of shut up some of these, Buckeyes folks, it'd be a chance to play this gigantic brand that you haven't been on the same field with since 1992. And if it is USC, which maybe it seems like at some point in time it probably will be, or certainly could be, once again, that's a team that Georgia hasn't played since 1960, I don't believe. They played 3 times in the past. USC's won all 3. My gosh, how big of a deal would that be? It'd be huge. It'd be huge. Let me go to Facebook yet because I have not been there. We'll get a few more comments and we'll get ready to roll on. We have a lot coming up the next couple of days. Boy, oh boy, do we. And we're really excited about it because we love this time of year. And we're really excited about your comments on Facebook, although it always takes a while to get there. But now we're here. On Facebook, Nick Roundtree says, if the 12-team format had existed previously, the Dogs would have gotten in 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2007, 2008, 2011, 2012. He says Coach Rick would have had the team in 02, 05, 07, and 12 to win it all, I believe. Yeah, I mean, obviously, over the course of years, and maybe I only think this because of the fact that I'm so entrenched into Georgia football, but certainly in the current playoff era, I don't think there's any team that would have benefited from an expanded playoff more than Georgia would have, because you kind of referenced the Richt years, but Georgia clearly would have been a playoff team in 2018, and I honestly believe, I know they lost Alabama in the SEC championship, but I honestly believe that Georgia would have had a chance to win that championship in 2018. I really, really do. They might not have. Obviously, they lost Alabama in the SEC championship, but I think that Georgia was well positioned in 2018 for a playoff run. They just never quite got a chance to occur. I mean, Georgia lost twice and kind of had only itself to blame for why it didn't make the playoff. But a lot of us believe that Georgia probably was still one of the 4 best teams in the country and just didn't quite get a chance to show that there in that spot. 2019, they would have been in the playoff there too. I don't quite know the 2019 team would have done much when it got there. I hate to say that, but that's just honesty compels me to admit. But nonetheless, they would have been in a 12-team playoff. So, yeah, I mean, you kind of think about where Georgia is, what the 12-team playoff has a chance to be. It is going to be one of those deals where you have a chance to sort of think about those kinds of games every single year. And in the future, think about a 12-team regular season and a 4-game postseason, at least the potential of a 4-game postseason. Moving forward, the postseason is going to be 25% of your season. And it's going to be a little bit more like how you think of college basketball, for those of you who still think about college basketball at all, that you really judge these teams almost solely by what happens in March. It could be coming up soon that you're kind of judging teams like Georgia kind of solely by what happens December on, but it's sort of moving that direction maybe anyway. Keith Fold says, I don't see Georgia ever being left out of a 12-team playoff. I think the SEC is going to become really interesting once you get to that, because I mentioned this before. I think the Luke Fickell hiring at Wisconsin, spending bigger dollars than they ever have in the past to bring in the kind of coach that, they've probably kind of not quite aspired to that same level of coach in the past. And yet I think they know in the future divisionless world of the Big Ten, with all the money that's at stake, that the competition's about to get even more cutthroat and get even more intense. And a program like Wisconsin, has to now really commit itself to trying to play at the highest possible level that it can. And I think that's a little bit of a harbinger of what the SEC is going to be like in the future too, where, I mean, the SEC competition is so intense and the drama is always so laughable. It's soap opera up one side and down the other. But it's about to be even more so, because if you think in a 12-team playoff, 3 of those spots kind of belonging to the SEC, I'm with Keith. Hard to imagine Georgia being excluded from that anytime in the near future based on how Georgia's playing. But somebody that really thinks they're supposed to be in the playoff is not going to be there. I mean, like, think about the most recent SEC national champions. Georgia last year, Bama before that, LSU before that. And let's say, just for the sake of conversation, that's your 3 top teams in the SEC, because those are the 3 teams that have won national championships most recently. So what does that say for Florida? What does that say for Tennessee, who thinks they're building something under Josh Heupel? What does that say for Texas A&M that's not stopping spending money? I don't care how much they're disappointed by their current results. I mean, if anything, they're going to double down financially to try to Like, they are pot committed at this point in time. The idea that all of a sudden they're going to start shopping on the bargain aisle because the money they spent didn't work, I mean, they're going to double down financially, if anything. A program like Auburn is obviously going to fight a lot harder too. And so what's going to be interesting about the SEC moving forward is maybe it is simple enough to say right now the three top teams are LSU, Alabama, and Georgia, and those are the three teams you expect to be in the playoff more often than not when it expands. But boy, this expansion opportunity, this divisionless future, I think teams like Florida and Auburn and A&M, Tennessee, maybe South Carolina, I think they do probably view this as an opportunity for them to get back involved here a bit. So the SEC is going to be even more interesting in the future, even more interesting. Bill Sanders says half those players will be in the portal either this season or next. Yeah, a lot of those A&M guys are. But, the portal is going to be crazy. The portal is going to be insane. And I know we've said this now, but I really get the sense that this year's portal is going to be even crazier. Daniel Aldrich, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that. I really do. Listen, I'm a very lucky person that I love my job. And I'm actually, leaving my job is actually somewhat bittersweet because I love doing the show so much. I'm always really excited to come back and do the show. I'm always excited to talk about the stuff that I miss when I'm gone. This is one of those things that for next week, we're kind of on the Royal Caribbean schedule because they've invited us to be a part of this promotional cruise that's taking place during a specific time. And they're so nice and generous to give us a chance to do this. So we're kind of operating on their timeline on this, but it actually kind of works out okay. Whereas, hopefully Georgia wins 34-17, punches its ticket, playing Atlanta, and we can kind of casually get ready for the Peach Bowl. If that's not quite how this works out, things get a little bit trickier. But hopefully this is going to be nice and simple and, drama-free. That is my hope. You don't always get what you hope for in life, but that is certainly my hope. Matt Rugavina says, just wait in 4 years. We're going to have people clamoring for 16 teams. You probably will. I do think, though, that the college football playoff is a little bit calendar bound in that I don't think they have much of an appetite to stretch too far into January because it becomes very competitive with the NFL playoffs. And obviously, as popular as college football is, you are not going to go head-to-head and do very well against NFL playoff games. So there's a little bit of a calendar deadline. They feel like they have to be done by so-and-so date in January and kind of get off those weekends because the NFL is coming for them. And I also think that if the financial motivation is there to expand the playoff, I'm not quite so sure how much financial motivation there is to reduce the regular season. So at a certain point in time, I mean, unless you start playing these games earlier and earlier in the summer, which I guess you possibly could, but that gets a little tricky too because around here we're all back in school in August, but like a lot of places around the country, the world stops in August, right? Like our world in August that's when our kind of sort of fiscal year begins, but for a lot of places that's more of September. Communities kind of operate around a school calendar. And a lot of non-southeastern type places, the school calendar essentially starts in September. And so August is like the deadest time of the year, whereas for us, it's not quite that way. So my point is, and I'm just thinking out loud, for a lot of these communities, regions of the country where August means vacations, can you really do a bunch of college football stuff earlier in August and get the kind of TV audiences that you want? My guess is the networks do their research on this, and they probably know what the value of real estate is on a Saturday in August compared to a Saturday in early September. My guess is it's probably not the same thing. So while, Matt, I think you're right, the natural tendency is to want to expand things more and more and more as time goes on. Nothing seems to get smaller. Everything just gets bigger. I wonder how time-bound, calendar-bound the college football schedule kind of is. But that's just me sort of thinking out loud. Hugh Nash says, I'm Dog Nation's very own Captain Steubing. Is that the guy from Love Boat? Is that who that is? I'm guiding the Dog Nation ship with great care. Listen, I appreciate that. I'll start wearing like the big fancy, scrambled egg looking stuff on the side of the on my shoulders, like the captains do. I'll start doing that. Let's see what else. By the way, Jesse Dellinger in the comment section. We saw Jesse over at the DawgNation post-game show the other day. Jonathan Morris says, I think 12 will satisfy people for a while. That gives everyone an opportunity. I do think 12 reflects the best possible compromise that existed out there. Because believe it or not, and a lot of you are kind of aware of this, like the SEC did not want 8 at all. Like the one thing that you could not get anybody to talk about was 8. They were not interested in 18 playoff. That they either wanted 4 or they wanted 12. That I think the SEC folks thought 8 was just going to be a little watered down. That they either wanted to kind of keep dominating the 14 playoff or go to a 12-team playoff where they had a chance to get more of their league's teams in the playoff on a more regular basis. But 8 sort of felt like the kind of thing that benefited the smaller leagues more than it benefited the top league, the SEC. So 12 is sort of a reflection of, hey, we want more expansion for more money. We want more access for some of these leagues that are being kept out of this more often than not. And we want to obviously still reward the programs and the conferences that are performing at the highest level. And that's kind of what 12 reflects. Here's the other thing, too, y'all. I mean, I just think that the energy and the excitement around hosting a playoff game is going to be a really big deal. And any playoff game in Sanford Stadium is going to be huge. But, I mean, I have to admit, for like a lot of these Big Ten teams who, you know, they don't ever get to host cold weather games in their stadium in the winter, I think a lot of them are really excited about that. And in a roundabout way, that's kind of fun, I guess. I don't know. It's just different. So when that new era of the sport gets ushered in, I actually do think these home games for 5, 6, 7, 8 against 9, 10, 11, and 12 is going to be a pretty big deal. In fact, I think one of the things you can't lose sight of is that Jack Swarbrick, the Notre Dame athletic director, was on the committee that came up with this 12-team playoff model. And even though Notre Dame is not in a conference, officially speaking, and therefore would not be eligible for one of the top 4 seeds, he was still a part of the group that pushed the current model that's going to be in place, which to me is a little bit of an indicator that while competitively it's going to be cool to be able to advance and have a bye, kind of like you have in the NFL playoffs right now, but the real energy here is the excitement over having a team come into Notre Dame Stadium and play there in South Bend. Or that's what I think a lot of the energy is going to be about. There's going to be a lot of excitement about being 5, 6, 7, 8 and hosting a playoff game. And a fun debate goes on between, you know, who's 8 and who's 9, because that's the difference between having one in your stadium and going to somebody else's stadium. That's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big deal. Daniel Holtz talked about revenge for Georgia against LSU. I think there's definitely some of that out there. Mid 80s dog says, how do these smaller programs survive now? Kent State, etc. Yeah, I mean, the money crunch at the lowest level is really, really tough. And there are some kind of like group of 5 level programs who have a decent amount of money. There are some that don't have any money at all. We just saw UAB hire Trent Dilfer as its head coach. You know, Dilfer, former Elite 11, obviously won the Super Bowl with the Ravens, and then was the head coach of the Elite 11 quarterback camp for a long time. And recently he's been a head coach at a very good program in Tennessee, a high school program called Lipscomb. And so UAB is now hiring him as his head coach. And, hey, maybe this works great. Maybe it works terribly. But if you're a program like UAB, those are the kinds of coaching hires that sometimes you maybe feel like you have to make. You can't go spend $2 million for a coach, so you have to be a little bit creative about who you hire with the money that you have to spend. And so maybe you roll the dice on a guy like Dilfer, who's got coaching experience and got access to players, but, you know, a little bit non-traditional. So that's sometimes what you have to do. You look at Liberty, for instance, that just lost Hugh Freeze to Auburn. Liberty, an example of a team that's actually about to enter Conference USA, and they're probably more well-funded than any team in that league. And so if you really look across the group of 5 landscape, you do see some of this where within certain leagues, so-and-so's got a little bit of money, so-and-so has no money at all. And there are some programs that make decisions almost exclusively on the base of money. And everybody in the group of 5 level is making some sort of choice as it relates to money. Your specific example about Kent State, the way in which those programs kind of fund themselves right now is once they get to like conference season, the MAC plays almost no games on Saturday. They play almost every conference game on like Tuesday or Wednesday night or something like that because that's when TV was willing to put their games on. So they get money from ESPN in exchange for playing games during a time of year in which ESPN doesn't have other programming. So that's a little bit tricky. You know, I'm sure they don't have very good attendance for those games on Tuesday and Wednesday night, not like you would on Saturday, but there's just more money to be made from television, so that's the compromise they make in order to fund their program. George Bob says, to quote Stone Cold Steve Austin, Georgia's going to stomp a mud hole in LSU and walk it dry. Then everything takes care of itself. Recruits will becoming huge, portal or not. Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. That is great stuff, Georgia Bob. Really, really appreciate that. Stafford Square Dog also feeling good about his parking space for Saturday, which is a great thing to be able to hear. You love that. All right, final comments. Boy, it got late on us again. Back on YouTube here for a moment. Kirby's Belt says these kids are human. They need less competitive games to heal and get playing time. And I guess you do worry about that a little bit of, well, do you start taking more of those regular season games? This is some of that time to heal and rest up. That's not a very pleasant thought, but it may be on its way. Zebulon Owen says, BA, give us a family. That is certainly what Brian Kelly brought with him when he first got down here. And I asked the question last night at Marlowe's. It's like, how naive and stupid does he think Southerners are that we're going to fall for that family, fake mascot, and fake accent stuff? So, yeah, I mean, I want to beat up on Kelly for that as much as anything else. Buddy Lee Z says, who's my regular season offensive and defensive MVP for Georgia? I think defensive MVP is probably Christopher Smith. That's probably the name that I would go with there on that. I think the way that Jalen Carter's come on as of late, you would probably consider him. But Smith, for the season-long performance, is probably that guy for me. Offensively, my MVP for this year, I think you probably have to say it's Stetson Bennett. I don't say that lightly. And I think as you move towards the postseason, I think my hope is that Kenny McIntosh steps up in an even bigger way. And I think I'm hoping that Brock Bowers steps up in an even bigger way. But when you look at when Georgia's been at its best this year, you've had big games from Bennett, throwing a lot of touchdowns against Oregon. Obviously, the rushing touchdown and then a couple of those big throws against Tennessee. But the best from Georgia this year has included a lot from Bennett. So I'm not trying to just sort of like flippantly say the quarterback, but I don't know there's a name I would put above Bennett in that conversation right now. All right, let's get a couple more. Carter Evans said, with the College Football Playoff Committee push Michigan to number one if they have a blowout win and Georgia has a very close victory against LSU. I don't feel that would be correct since Purdue isn't in the top 25. And Carter, I've talked about this a couple times. I actually mentioned this with Mike Griffith yesterday, is that now let's say that Michigan wins 56-0 and that Georgia wins by a single point. Like if you have a really extreme scenario like that, I'm talking about very, very extreme, then I guess anything is kind of possible. But I think your overall point of view is one that I've also expressed, which is that the committee had every opportunity to rank Purdue, and they didn't. I mean, look at some of the teams who've been ranked in recent weeks. In Louisville the other day, you've had NC State when they were a 4-loss team. I mean, it's not like the bottom part of this top 25 is some august body of impressive resumes. It's kind of a haphazard thrown together list down there at the bottom. So there would have been almost no one who would have batted an eye had they ranked Purdue. Purdue's not ranked the AP top 25, but I think the committee could have ranked Purdue on Saturday if it wanted to, and I don't know that anybody would have really noticed that much one way or the other. So I think that's a little bit of a tip of the hand that the Big Ten title game isn't all that consequential for this committee coming up on Saturday. So if you're going to make the case that, hey, this race to be number one isn't over yet, boy, you're asking Michigan to do a lot against a team that right now the committee doesn't think enough to even rank, even though they've won like 3 straight and they obviously won their division. They could have ranked the Boilermakers. They just didn't. So I'm going to assume it takes a huge total, a huge margin of victory for the committee to even notice Michigan here in this spot. And ultimately, it still probably comes down to Georgia just not playing particularly well against LSU. Now, if Georgia loses, it loses the number one spot. I think that's pretty clear. But if Georgia wins by almost any margin, my bet would be they will stay at number one. I obviously believe they should stay at number one. That'll be 5 ranked wins for them if they were to beat LSU on Saturday. So I'm assuming, and my assumptions oftentimes can be proven wrong, but I am assuming that'll be enough to keep them at that number one spot. But I think that is a good question. I think you're zeroing in on the right part of this, which is what exactly does this committee think of Purdue? And frankly, it thinks a lot less of Purdue than it thinks of LSU, even with the Tigers coming off a loss this past weekend as well. So that is our R.S. Andrews cool down for today. Obviously, SEC Championship in Atlanta and plenty of great coverage of the SEC Championship from our friends of the AJC there as well. You can check all of that out online, ajc.com. Also, holiday guide to get you in the Christmas spirit. They got that for you online, ajc.com there as well. And the political stuff, you got the the senatorial runoff here coming up pretty soon. That's getting hot and heavy. You can get more on that online, ajc.com too. I was a little bit surprised by this. I don't really care this much, but I was surprised that Brent Key, one of his first acts as becoming the full-time head coach of Georgia Tech, he fired Chip Long, the offensive coordinator. I thought Long down the stretch actually probably did a pretty good job for them. So I don't really care, but I did think that was kind of weird that he fired Long. So you can read more about that online at ajc.com if you'd as well. And Braves off-season hot stove stuff, that online as well. ajc.com for a lot more on that. Now, as we say goodbye, big thanks to our friends at R.S. Andrews, making the R.S. Andrews cool down possible. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. They'll take care of all that for you. It was cold again last night. We left Marlowe's. It was real cold. It was shockingly cold. So we had the heat on again last night at my house. And if you're turning that heat on and you're kind of worried, it's going to make that weird noise and that like rumbling weird noise that sometimes it makes. If you're worried about that, or if you're just worried about it just not working at all, then go ahead and get some peace of mind. Get that unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs. Our friends at R.S. Andrews can help you out with that. You can find them online, rsandrews.com for more on that. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow. Special show from us live at live around Mercedes-Benz Stadium for a big SEC championship preview. We'll look forward to talking to you then. DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp. Have a great day, everybody.